Hello scientists! Today we're going to talk about organelles. Our big idea for this lesson is that organelles are structures inside of a cell that work together to perform the function of that cell. We'll add in a few other structures that don't technically count as organelles but are important to the cell structure and function. We'll start by looking at the structures that make up an animal cell. The first is the cell membrane. This is a layer of fats or lipids that protect the cell, provides a barrier or a boundary between the inside and the outside of the cell. And the cell membrane also controls what's able to enter and leave the cell. The cytoplasm is everything in between the cell membrane and the nucleus. This includes most of the organelles and what I like to think about as a scaffolding which allows things to be transported from one part of the cell to another. Next, we have the nucleus, which is the control center, or kind of like the brain of the cell. The nucleus contains all of the cell's DNA, which is the instructions for making proteins. There's a dense region at the center of the nucleus called the nucleolus. This is where the cell starts to make ribosomes, which we'll talk about more in a minute. The nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear membrane, similar to the cell membrane. And you can see in the diagram that it's full of pores, because it's important for those instructions to be able to be transported so that the other parts of the cell can have the instructions for the proteins. Next, we have a vacuole, which we'll talk about more with the plant cell. Mitochondria convert the chemical energy from food into a form that the cell can use. You might have heard them called the powerhouse of the cell. The membrane contains lots of folded membrane. This is where the conversion reaction happens. So the more membrane there is, the more reactions can happen. This helps with the mitochondria's efficiency. Another interesting fact about mitochondria is that they have their own DNA. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is the part of the cell where lipids or fats are made. They're important for the membranes in the cell. Ribosomes, which we talked about as being made in the nucleolus, use the instructions from DNA to make proteins. They can either be in the cytoplasm, which we would call free ribosomes, or attached to the rough ER. The rough ER, or the rough endoplasmic reticulum, is rough because it's covered in those ribosomes. After the ribosome makes the proteins move into the rough ER, where they're folded and modified. Then they get packed into a vesicle, which is like a little package with a lipid membrane, and then they're sent to something called the Golgi body. At the Golgi body, the proteins are further modified and packaged and sorted, and then they're sent to other specific locations. That might be inside the cell or another location outside of the cell. Finally, we have lysosomes. They're filled with enzymes, which are a type of protein, and these proteins have the job of cleaning up the cell. Lysosomes are where waste, old organelles, and intruders, maybe viruses or bacteria, are destroyed. Next, we'll move on to plant cells, which have a couple different structures than animal cells. The first is the cell wall. The cell wall is a rigid structure that supports and protects the cell. It sits outside the cell membrane, and it's found in plant cells along with most prokaryotic cells. Next, we have a vacuole, which is also found in animal cells. It's a sac-like structure that stores water, salts, proteins, and carbohydrates. In plant cells, you can see that it takes up a large part of the cell, and when it's full, it creates rigidity. It keeps the cell membrane pushed up against the cell wall, which is how plant cells like to be. The final structure that's unique to plant cells is something called a chloroplast. Chloroplasts take the energy from sunlight and they convert it into a form that the cell can use. This is similar to mitochondria, but instead of taking energy from food, they're getting their energy from the sun. Chloroplasts have two membranes and they have their own DNA. And they're green because they have a pigment called chlorophyll. And like we said before, chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. Otherwise, plant cells have most of the same organelles that animal cells have. A cell membrane, a nucleus, a rough ER that's covered in ribosomes. There would also be free ribosomes in a plant cell. Golgi bodies. a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, lysosomes, and of course the cytoplasm. That's it for today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.